Okay, so let's go ahead and start getting into ACLs, access control lists. So, a couple things that we're going to kind of go over is we're going to talk a little bit about what the purpose of ACLs are, how they work, quick review on wildcard masks again, guidelines for kind of general ACL creations, and then different types of ACLs that we can use, specifically standard and extended. So, again, what is an ACL? In layman's terms, the easiest way to think of an ACL is it's a firewall. It's just a firewall. Cisco just has their term called an ACL access control list. And then we have what's known as ACEs, access control entries, which are essentially the rules themselves that are placed on the ACL. So basically, just think of it as ACEs are rules, ACL is a firewall. Why we have to have something named differently, I don't know, but we do. So, a couple things to one thing to kind of note that's pretty common and just makes things a little bit more confusing as well. So when we say ACE, they're often commonly referred to as ACL statements. So you'll probably hear myself say an ACL, write an ACL multiple times. That's typically going to be relating to, say, writing a general rule to stop or permit specific type of traffic. Um, Now, one thing to note with how routers read everything is they read our rules, our ACEs, in sequential order, so from top to bottom, and they pick the best match. And once they pick the very best match, they're done reading, and they won't read any further rules down below it. So that's an important thing to kind of know. So that process is what's known as packet filtering. So again, kind of looking into it, like why do we actually have ACLs? What's the purpose of it? Some general items that we have and reasons why we use them. It limits network traffic, so that can technically increase network performance if we have a large amount of traffic flowing through our network. We can kind of drop useless or unnecessary traffic, which can help from a latency standpoint, or just general resource standpoint of the devices being utilized. Flow control, some very basic level of security and network access. In fact, the way we're going to be talking about ACLs and kind of writing ACs, this is an older way of kind of writing rules. We still do this sometimes in our areas, but for the most part, typically for most networks, there is a standalone firewall device, such as like a FortiGate or WatchGuard or Palo Alto device that's actually going to be utilized as our standalone edge uh, firewall. And that's where most of the rules are going to be written. Other things to kind of just talk about briefly too is that typically our rules, how we're going to be writing them, is all through the command prompt. Now, in most organizations, again, because you're using, say, like an edge device, say, like again, like a Palo Alto or FortiGate or FortiGuard, whatever you want to call it. Generally, those are done with some form of a GUI interface. Now, so why are we learning about how to do this? Why are we doing this? Because the structure of writing any firewall rule is the same, whether you're working on a GUI, whether you're writing out in a command prompt, it's all identical. And that's a general process of how we kind of write our rules. So we need to know the syntax, basically, of how to properly create and craft a rule, because regardless of how you're inputting it, the syntax is the same. So that's the nice thing of kind of doing this. So this is good practice. So we can filter traffic based on traffic type. So this is a yes and a no. It depends on the type of ACL that we're writing. If we're writing standard ACLs, not so much. If we're writing extended ACLs, we have a bit more control. So we can permit or deny access to specific network services as well. Kind of falls into filtering traffic, and provide priority to certain different types of classes of network traffic as well. So our ACLs work At layer 3 and layer 4 in the OSI model, standard ACL works strictly at layer 3. In fact, I think I can pull up a quick little file here that might help with what we're looking at from a syntax perspective. So from a syntax perspective of how we actually write our ACLs, so what we're going to look at is say, let's just zoom into this little box right here that I've kind of highlighted. So with a standard ACL, we're very limited in what we can actually specify. We can specify permit or deny. We can specify just the source IP address, and we can also only specify the destination IP. Or actually, no, we can't even do that. So it's really just permit and deny, and then the source IP address. So it's very, very basic in what we can really kind of specify. So that's it with standard ACLs. So we can only say we're permitting or denying and a certain source IP address, whether it's a single IPv4 address or a network address. So very limited in what we can do. Extended ACLs, however, we have a lot more granularity to them, and we can do a lot more. So with an extended ACL, we have everything that's listed right here. So we can specify permit or deny, what protocol we're using, so like TCP, UDP, ICMP. We can specify a source IPv4 address, whether it's a single address or an entire network, a source port, which sometimes is useful, but we don't always utilize source port. Typically, we will leave the source port blank. We have our destination IPv4 address, which is where are we going. Again, that can be a single address or a network address. Our destination port, that one's important because that specifies what service I'm specifically looking for, whether it's like 80 or 443, which is like HTTP, HTTPS, whether it's SSH, Telnet. That's where our destination port comes into play. And then our last two options that we can utilize too are ICMP type and established. And these come into play a little bit later depending on the protocol that we're utilizing. So ICMP type is going to be if our protocol is for, well, obviously ICMP. And this allows us to specify the different types of messages that we might want to allow through our network based off of the ICMP response. So do I want to allow requests? Do I want to allow replies? Do I want to? So that's the general idea. Our established is talking about the stateful relationship between two devices. So whether I have an established connection between those two areas. More times than not, when we're writing and working with our ACLs, these last two columns we don't typically utilize very frequently. So for most times, what we typically focus on are an extended ACL is permitted deny, protocol, source IPv4, source port, destination IPv4, and destination port. So other things to kind of note is we have to think about how ACLs actually operate and the way where we apply them. Now, the where we apply them defines essentially whether traffic is going in or out through the router. So if I applied, let's say that there was a G00 interface on R1 off on this right hand side where that inbound or left hand side where this inbound ACL is. If I applied an ACL and I wanted traffic to filter traffic going out towards, say, the internet, which is on our right hand side, then I would apply the rule on this G00 interface on the left there, and I would say access control ACL number 1 or 101 and say in. And so this would now say any traffic going into this router before it gets processed and determined where it's going to be routed, I'm going to read and apply this firewall rule to any incoming traffic that's accepted on that G00 interface. Now, if I applied the ACL on the opposite side, if we call that on the right-hand side, say G01, which is by that outbound ACL, what would happen there if I placed there is the traffic would go into our G00 interface off on the left here. The traffic would get routed, fully processed, and determined where it was supposed to be sent. And then as it's getting prepared and rebuilt back into a frame and being ready to be sent out this G01 interface right here, then it would have to go through and pass through my outbound ACLs before it's allowed to leave the router. So think of it as inbound means traffic that's going into the router, outbound is traffic that's leaving the router. So that's what we have to determine when we're writing our ACL rules whether this is for traffic coming inbound traffic or outbound traffic. So we're applying it based off of the flow of traffic through the router itself. So when we actually go through and kind of write an ACL, our ACL again reads from the top down. So the router will always start at the very top ACL. They'll compare that source IPv4 address to each specific ACE in the order that they have been entered in. Once a match has been made, then the router is going to carry out whatever those permit or denied directions are, and then it ignores the rest of the ACLs. So you have to be very careful with how you place your access list or your ACL rules in what order you're applying them. So one thing to note is that there is at the very bottom of every single firewall, and I mean every single firewall, doesn't matter whether it's Cisco or any other device, there is always an implicit deny that exists. Now, this may or may not be listed when you actually show your firewall rules, but there is a deny all rule that always exists. So if traffic goes through and it doesn't match anything listed on these rules here, then it goes to the deny all and the traffic gets blocked and gets stopped. So that's another thing to kind of note when you're kind of writing your rules. As soon as you apply a firewall rule or a firewall to an interface, there is an implicit deny that immediately gets taken effect, and so it will stop all traffic immediately. So just keep that in mind when we're kind of going through stuff. So wildcard masks, we've already talked about wildcard masks prior. I'm not going to talk too much about it. Just remember that a wildcard mask it's just the remainder. They're going to go through and try and show you the binary and stuff. I hate looking at the binary. Easiest way to kind of just look at it is, again, all a wildcard mask is it's just the remainder of what a standard mask is. So if I have a 255.255.255.0, and that's our standard mask, right? The wildcard mask is just what's left over from that mask. So if there's all 255 in the first octet, well, there's 0 bits remaining. There's 0 bits remaining in the second. There's 0 bits remaining in the third, but there's since the fourth octet is set to a 0, I have 255 bits remaining in my fourth octet. And so that's my wildcard mask. So other things to look at too, if we wanted to do like one more quick one, let's say I had 255, 255, 255, 128, right? And that's my standard mask. So my wildcard mask would be 0, 0, 0. And what's the remainder there? Well, if we just look at, say, like, if you want to just pull up a calc, just do 255 minus 128. So we have our mask would be a 127. So pretty simplistic from that side of things. Is the wildcard mask is just whatever is left over from your remainder mask. If you want to go into the binary, I'm happy to go over it, but it's kind of seems like it's making it more complicated than it really needs to be. So a couple of things to note though, when we're writing ACLs, is there are a couple of keywords that we can use to replace having to write the mask. So we can use two keywords. We can say host or we can say any. So a host is going to be useful if I'm writing an ACL that's going to be applied to a single IP address. So if I wanted to apply an IP address to say 192.168.10.10, and I wanted to say allow or deny that specific rule, I could say in front of that the keyword host 192.168.10.10, and then that will automatically, that keyword will automatically go right. This is a slash 32. So all it's a single address. I'm not going to be specifying anything beyond that. Now, the other opposite thing that we have is, say, if I wanted to permit everything, you wouldn't typically do this, but if you wanted to, say, like permit anything to go through your network, remember we have our gateway of last resort, also known as a quad 0. So our 0.0.0.0/0, right? Well, if I had to write that out in longhand, that's 8 zeros. It's not too hard to write it out. Or I can just replace it by just saying the keyword any. So any is basically the equivalent of a gateway of last resort. So if I wanted to write a rule to say permit 192.168.10.10 to any address, if we look at our rule set here, I would write something like permit, we'll just say IP host 192.168.10.10. Our source port would be NA, not applicable because we don't care about it. And our destination IPv4 would be, say, any. So that would allow me to go, say, allow that single host IP address to any destination IPv4 address. So that's one thing to kind of know. Now, if I wanted to limit to say, hey, I wanted it to only be able to go to, say, like HTTPS, well, I can put then a destination port of 443, and now this host address at 10.10 is allowed to go to any IPv4 address, but only if it's asking for a destination port of 443. If it asks for any other port, it goes down, it does not match, and so it goes to our deny all rule. Now, another thing to note, kind of why are wildcards being going over again? That's because when we're writing our ACL rules in Cisco, we have to write them with a wildcard mask as we're actually applying them. So again, if I was to write out this rule, same rule But longhand, we'd say something like permit IP, and I'd say 192.168.10.10, and then a wildcard mask of 0000 NA, and then a destination port, sorry, excuse me, destination IPv4 address of all zeros with a mask of all zeros as well. And so this rule that I just wrote right here is equivalent to the rule that's written right up above. Or sorry, my mask there would be 255 for a wild card. So so we have our address of saying I'm allowing to any address, and then the mask or wildcard mask, which is all 255s. So that's why we have to do wildcard. So guidelines for ACL creation. Kind of some quick and general things. So you can only have a certain number of ACLs per router interface. That might not sound like a lot, but it's actually a huge amount. So think of it as you can only have 4 total firewalls per interface, which is way more than you would probably need anyway. But within each of those firewalls, you can have essentially as many firewall rules as you want. So you can apply, say 100 plus firewall rules all on a single firewall. And that's what we mean. So we can not only have a total of 4 ACLs, but we can have many, many, many ACEs within each ACL. So the number that we can actually have, this is typically only if we're using, say, dual stack. So we're using both IPv4 and IPv6. Otherwise, you can think of it as it's 2 firewalls per protocol. So I can have per interface. So I can put an IPv4 firewall for outbound traffic. I can put an IPv4 firewall for inbound traffic. And then I can do the same thing for IPv6. So all in all, we can have a total of 4 ACLs per interface. Honestly, you probably will never see that. That's kind of overkill. But you might see it, but probably not. So again, some general best ideas of kind of what they want you to do. This one's kind of common. It's base your firewalls off of your organizational security policies. Well, that should be a no-brainer. Write out what you want to do with your ACLs. This is very important. And then the next thing that they say is use a text editor to create and edit. Yes, but the first bullet where it says write it out, that's probably the best advice they can give you, which is write out what you want your firewall rules to look like, and then write your firewalls down on that paper. Make sure that the order is correct so that you logically understand what's going to happen. You can kind of think through it in a logic style for yourself. And then once you've finished writing your rules, then go in to, say, the actual Cisco device and write the rule to actually be applied. So that's the important thing. And then obviously test your ACLs too. Hopefully you have like a development area that you can test it, so that you don't have to test it on a production environment, because there's no faster way to break the internet, your internet connection, than to try and write a firewall rule on a production network. You'll start getting some very quick phone calls going, "Hey, where'd the internet go?" So, um, so again, I've already talked briefly about this. We have 2 types of ACLs. that we can utilize with Cisco for IPv4. We have standard ACLs and we have extended ACLs. So standard ACLs, really it's just permit and deny, and then only the source IPv4 address that we want to use. Extended ACLs, like I said, permit, deny, source address, destination address, source port, destination port, and the protocol, along with a couple extra things as well. So when we're writing ACLs, we have two ways that we can write it. We can write either numbered ACLs or we can create named ACLs. Grand scheme of things, it does not matter when you're really writing your ACLs for Cisco, unless they specifically tell you, hey, write a named ACL, or hey, write a numbered ACL. Um, Overall, number doesn't really matter too much, or name doesn't really matter too much. Where they do matter is that there are a set range of numbers that we can utilize for either standard or extended ACLs. So for standard ACLs, I can only pick the numbers between 1 and 99, whereas for extended ACLs, I can pick pretty much between 100 and 199. Now, there's higher numbers as well. You can use 1300 to 1999 or 2000 to 2,699 for extended. Why? I don't know why you'd ever want to, but you can. Um, but typically, you're going to pick from 1 to 99 or 100 to 199. Essentially, what this just means is these numbers, by default, if I pick any number between 1 and 99 when I'm writing my access list, the router will automatically assume that I'm writing a standard ACL and will only give me the syntax options for writing a standard ACL. Vice versa, if I pick 100, then it'll work from there. So named ACL, it's pretty much the exact same, but the primary thing to note is that instead of with a numbered ACL where we just start by saying access-list, for a named ACL, we have to say IP access-list, and then we can then, after we say access-list, we can call a command to either make this named ACL standard or extended with just those two keywords. I can either say extended or I can say standard, and then follow it with the name of the firewall that I want to call it. So in this case, for their example, they're creating a named extended ACL called FTP-filter. And then once they do that, it drops them into what you can see config-ext-nacl. That stands for extended named ACL. And that's in that configuration area. And then we write our rules in that section right there. So where do we place ACLs? So they're basically standard ACLs have to go closest to the destination. No ifs, ands, or buts. That's the only way this works. If I wrote an ACL rule that basically said this PC1 192.168.10.10 was not allowed to communicate with this 30.12 PC, if I place the ACL on router 1 at the G00 interface, remember the only thing I can specify is permit or deny, and then this source IP address. So I would say deny 192.168.10.10. Well, if I did that, and I placed it on the G00 interface of router 1, I just blocked PC1 from being able to get to any other device on this network. Well, if I place down the serial 010 interface, well, PC1 would still be able to now talk to PC2, but it wouldn't be able to go beyond that, and it wouldn't be able to communicate with the server over there, or say the internet. Same thing if I placed down the serial 011, it also would stop traffic as well, and I still wouldn't be able to talk to either of these. So the only place I can put a standard ACL is in that rule example, which is again to stop PC1 to be able to talk to PC3, is to place that traffic on the G000 interface on router 3 going outbound. So this is the flow of traffic as it is going towards its destination. So it would come through PC1, go to router 1, go to router 2, router 3, and then as it was getting processed, it would go out of G00, and that's where that rule would be applied, and it would block that traffic. So that's our standard ACLs. So again, standard ACLs have to go closest to the destination. Extended ACLs can go wherever you want them to, but the best practice is to try and place them as close to the source as possible. Now, the reason we want to place it as close to the source as possible is to limit network congestion and reduce resource usage on our devices. So the closer I place a firewall rule to a source, the less that traffic will actually travel or take up other devices. So I could place in that same rule, that extended ACL, of say deny PC1 from going to PC3, but now I can specify, say, whether it's ICMP traffic, it's TCP traffic, UDP, all IP traffic. I can specify a protocol um, or a source, a source port and a destination port. So what service it's asking for. So we can have a lot more granular control. And it works whether I place out R1, R2, or R3, or on any of these kind of interfaces from where the PC1 is going to PC3. But if I place it on R1 on the G000 interface, then that traffic will never, if it's going to be denied or dropped anyway, it's best to drop it as early as possible so that I'm not utilizing resources unnecessarily on the following devices. So that's the general gist. So talked about that. We've talked about replacements. I talked about extended ACLs. So yeah, hopefully that was helpful. I'll have some more ACL stuff and some ACL demos coming up soon. All right.